Re-
All right, I'd like to call our next meeting to order. And we'll call all members of council are present, and I'll dispense with the land acknowledgement that was done in previous meeting. To the members, any disclosure of pecuniary interest in the agenda is presented to you this afternoon. Hearing none, that duly noted. Thank you. And so the introduction purpose of our meeting today is to hear comments on a new proposed zoning bylaw. And at this stage here, before calling delegations in that, I'm going to call on Mr. Jeffries to add any introductory comments and plus introduce our guests here this afternoon. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good evening, members of council. Late last year, the town retained the services of WSP consultants who are land use consultants that specialize in the development of zoning bylaws. And with us tonight are Bobby Gauthier and Matthew Rodriguez from WSP, and they're going to have a PowerPoint presentation for council and hope to engage council in a bit of a discussion and get some direction from you. So they're ultimately here to assist with the preparation of a new zoning bylaw, which will replace the 3 existing bylaws of the former municipalities of Tecumseh, St. Clair Beach, and Sandwich South. And just as a quick refresher, a zoning bylaw regulates the use of land in the municipality. It assigns a zone category to every single lot in the municipality and establishes the permitted uses for that zone, along with provisions such as where the buildings can be located, how tall the buildings can be, lot coverage, minimum number of parking spaces, and a number of other regulatory issues. In addition to consolidating the 3 existing bylaws into one new zoning bylaw, this new zoning bylaw will implement the policies of the new Tecumseh official plan, which have to be implemented through the zoning bylaw. It'll increase the clarity intent of various terms and regulations that are now maybe not that consistent in the bylaw, and it will provide consistency of regulations across the town. It will update the zones and the mapping associated with those zones in the zoning bylaw, and it will address emerging themes and trends in planning, because the current bylaws are quite dated and there's a need to update it to address those issues. The process will take place in 4 phases, and I won't get into too much detail about that because I know that Bobby and Matthew are going to get into more detail with respect to the process. But phase one, which was completed late last year, culminated in the development of a technical memo that summarized background research. There was an open house held in December, and that led to phase two, where a technical memo number 2 was prepared that outlined a series of key zoning issues, along with options and recommendations that require a little more discussion and direction from council. And that's why we're here tonight, to have that discussion with you. The technical memo number 2, it does not contain an exhaustive list of key issues. There are other issues, and there may be some that you felt that we haven't addressed to your satisfaction. We encourage you to raise those tonight with us. Tomorrow, there will be an open house, so the public can come out, view the document, and share with us any issues that they feel need to be addressed through the new zoning bylaw. And then once we get some discussion and feedback from both council and the public and other key stakeholders, we'll start to develop the draft zoning bylaw, bring that back to council for review, hold some more public consultation, and ultimately we'll prepare the final draft that will have to have a statutory public meeting in accordance with the Planning Act. So that's the process in a nutshell. Tonight, we're here to have this discussion with council, get some direction on the key issues. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bobby and Matthew.
So as the delegation comes forward, members of council, we do have a report on the agenda, and that, if I could have a motion to move the report forward. Thank you, Councillor Higginson and Councillor Houston. All in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you very much. Your worship, members of council, it's great to meet you. My name is Bobby Goche. I'm a practice lead with WSP. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Matthew Rodriguez, who is a senior planner with WSP. And we're very excited to be meeting you and kicking off this project. Next slide, please. So as Chad pointed out earlier, we're pretty early on in the process. We're not here tonight to present a draft zoning bylaw to you. We're here to present kind of a sense of what we think the key changes are required to be made to the bylaws to bring them up to a modern standard and to consolidate these documents. So if it's okay with council, we're perfectly fine with having more of an informal discussion. If you'd like to jump in as I work through the presentation, I feel like if I go through the whole presentation all at once, it's just a lot of information to digest. So feel free to jump in when you'd like to. And I'll also pause at some of the key milestones. So we'll start out just with a bit of a background presentation, give a bit of an overview on the timeline for the project, how we see this new zoning bylaw coming together. And then after that, we'll give you a bit of a summary on the work that was completed as part of phase 1 of this project. So phase 1 was the background stage, and we're now moving into phase 2, where we kind of build on some of those directions and start to write the zoning bylaw. We'll have sort of the workshop, and like I said, we'll keep things informal. Feel free to jump in with questions at any time. And then at the end, if there are some other ideas that pop into your head, we've got some open time at the end to go over those items. And then we'll just close off with some next steps. Next slide. So in terms of the project team, just very briefly, we've been working very closely with a team of town staff consisting of Brian, of Chad, of Enrico, who've been great to work with, and they've been providing excellent guidance since we've started the project. We're of course going to be working with other departments in the town as well. That's just sort of the core team listed on the slide. And then as I said, my name is Bobby Goche, and I'm here with Matt Rodriguez, and we're the core team on behalf of WSP. Next slide. Next slide again. Yeah, thank you. So in terms of some overview statements on this project, Chad's kind of gone over this a little bit, but I think it's worth kind of recapping what zoning bylaws are. So zoning bylaws, I think, as you know, are municipal bylaws. They're passed by council, and they are legal tools that are used to regulate the use of land. They regulate the size, the location, the character of buildings and structures. So the zoning bylaw, I think, has more than any other document a significant bearing on the character and the shape and the look of the town. One of the key objectives of this project is to modernize and consolidate the 3 zoning bylaws that the town currently administers. So there's 3 zoning bylaws that exist just by virtue of the fact that there was a prior municipal amalgamation. And we're looking to merge these bylaws into one. And there's a ton of benefits that go along with that. One benefit is streamlined administration. The town doesn't have to administer a different set of regulations depending on where you are in the town. And also, I think it'll be an opportunity for us to prepare a bylaw that is just easier for the public to find zoning information. And what I see too as a benefit of consolidating the bylaws is the notion of fairness and equity. You know, we've heard from some of the members of the public in our previous phase, you know, that they don't like to be subject to different rules than some of their neighbors when it doesn't make sense for that to happen. So we're looking to clean that up and make things nice and equitable and fair across the town. Next slide, please. So in terms of the timeline for the project, as Chad said, we're going through what we call a four-phase process. Phase one was our background stage. Phase one was really about us as the consultants new to the town, wrapping our heads around the policy context, wrapping our heads around what the zoning bylaws currently look like in the town, and coming up with a sense of what changes do we need to make to these bylaws? What are we sort of getting ourselves into? And we had an open house at the end of December to consult the public on some of the key changes that we were looking to make. And we've moved forward on the basis of that work with some of the work in phase two. And phase two, again, consists of furthering our understanding of the issues to be addressed in the project and fleshing out what I think is really a clear game plan for writing the new zoning bylaw. So we're still very much in the phase of gathering information, collecting input and viewpoints, and starting to understand what this new zoning bylaw is going to look like. Phase three, which we're not into yet, will be the phase when we actually draft the new zoning bylaw. So we'll put all the provisions together, we'll consult with the public and with stakeholders, and we'll of course have a statutory public open house to meet the requirements of the Planning Act. And then in phase four, we'll be looking to refine the bylaw. So there'll be several iterations of the bylaw. I really view the process of developing a zoning bylaw as a very iterative kind of a process. There's no way that we're going to get it perfectly right in our first cut at it. It's going to take a few tries. We'll have to get feedback from people and then refine the product until everybody's satisfied with it. So that kind of wraps up how it'll look. And then in phase four, we'll need to conduct a statutory public meeting required by the Planning Act, and then bring the bylaw forward for council to adopt. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background context. Actually, I'll just maybe stop there and just see if there's any questions or thoughts about some of the background information in the process I've presented so far.
Okay. Just the timing of these. I know you've got, you know, phase one, we're in halfway, or we're in phase two. So when do you expect, you know, the next phase, phase 3 and 4?
That's a great question. So we're looking to wrap up phase 2 essentially within about a month from now, something like that. So we're going to have our open house tomorrow night. We'll collect our input and we'll finalize our discussion paper based on that. Over the course of the summer, we'll be writing the draft bylaw, and we're kind of expecting to be going out to the public early in the fall with that draft bylaw. So ideally, overall, completion of the project, we're looking at end of 2023. I could see it maybe jumping a little bit into early 2024, depending on the kinds of comments we get, but that's sort of an overall target at this point. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Jobin.
Thank you. Through you. Just something that's coming to my mind here. The statement that standards need to be consistent across Tecumseh. They won't be, because we already typically have two different worlds, really. I mean, some of our residents don't have rural water. You know, we saw some differences in rat services provided in the north end and south end, as well as the garbage pail pickup. So when you talk about being consistent, we won't harmoniously ever be. There's different amenities in the different cultures, but so I'm going to keep that in mind as we go forward and just and try to understand what you mean by the consistencies. Like, would it be property standard bylaws? Like what consistency are you looking at when I'm looking at the whole picture of it all being consolidated?
I appreciate the question through you, Mr. Chair. So Absolutely. There's going to be a need for different standards across different contexts in the town. 100%. We'll be setting up different zones that provide different lot and building standards based on the character of the neighborhoods, based on the direction of the official plan. But I guess when I say we're looking to try to make some of the standards consistent, is the fact that the town currently has 3 separate bylaws. And in some cases, it may not make sense to have different standards across different areas of the town. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. So when we do have an opportunity to streamline the standards where it makes sense to do that, that's kind of what we're looking at here. Okay. So a bit more context around the zoning in Tecumseh today. So as I mentioned, there's 3 existing zoning bylaws the town administers, and that comprises 33 different zone categories. So there are quite a few zones that the town currently administers. We don't think there's necessarily need to retain all 33 zones. We might be able to merge some of them to simplify the bylaw. And then, of course, as is common in many municipalities, the town has accumulated over 250 exception zones. An exception zone is essentially what council passes for a site-specific development. So oftentimes there's a need to apply special development standards to a specific lot, and that gets passed via an exception zone. So over time, the town's accumulated lots of them. We'll be looking to review those against the official plan, possibly simplify and delete some of them where we possibly can. But I think that'll be a case-by-case kind of a review process. Next slide, please. So some of the key project drivers. So, what are some of the things guiding this process? Certainly, I think it's important to recognize the role of the Planning Act. The Planning Act is the provincial legislation that gives municipalities the right to pass zoning bylaws. So at a minimum, we need to make sure that the new zoning bylaw for Tecumseh is going to be within sort of the limits of what the Planning Act allows zoning bylaws to regulate. So some things can't be regulated in zoning and some things can, and we got to make sure that we're consistent with that legislation. The other thing I'll say too is the existing zoning bylaws, of course, predate the town's new official plan. So the town has a new official plan passed in 2021, and it sets out sort of a new vision for the town. And one of our responsibilities under the Planning Act is to review the zoning bylaws against the official plan. So we actually have to, as a requirement of the project, make sure that the new zoning bylaw conforms to and meets the policies of the official plan. And I'll talk about what some of that means as we move through the presentation. And I think I touched on the last bullet there as well. So in terms of the discussion paper, so as I said, we've completed phase 1 of the project, and phase 1 again was the background phase for the project. We took some time to collect our understanding of the issues. So I think the discussion paper represents a good resource if the public or if members of council want some background information. You'll find some introductory information about the project. You'll find a summary of some of the background research. So we've summarized the applicable policy documents. And we've also identified a set of kind of key issues that need to be explored and addressed in this project. So we began to wrap our heads around what consolidation of these bylaws means, and we began to wrap our heads around some of the other broad policy topics that we have to address. So that was the purpose of the discussion paper. New zoning bylaw principles. So one of the items in the discussion paper is a list of what we call principles. So what are some of the values, the objectives that we're trying to achieve through this project? One of them is we want to create a user-friendly new zoning bylaw. As much as possible, I think this is an opportunity to reduce cost on town staff in administering the bylaw. And so having a user-friendly document that most residents will be able to look up zoning information, I think will be a big benefit to the town. Again, looking for consistency across Tecumseh. Of course, where it's appropriate to have consistency across Tecumseh, certainly we'll have to retain some of the details of the zoning that's existing now. We're looking to modernize zoning terms. So, we want this bylaw to reflect current business practice, current development practice. What kinds of uses is the town dealing with today? We want to make sure that the bylaw is written in a way that it's allowing for that in the appropriate places in the town. We want to be innovative where we can. So we want to come up with solutions that are specific to the town of Tecumseh. I don't want to simply lift ideas from other municipalities, but we want to craft provisions that work for the town. We do want to minimize legal nonconformity as well and legal noncompliance. So, and what that means is, to the extent possible, we don't want the new zoning bylaw to create non-compliance. We want to reflect what's existing now and continue with those permissions. We don't want to rock the boat a whole lot. We want to carry forward permissions, provided they meet the official plan. And then finally, we want to respond to public and stakeholder input. We're kind of carrying out this process in a collaborative way. Our intent is to collect issues from the community and make sure that we're responding to those issues. Next slide, please.
Just on that, when you talk about non-conforming, I mean, I look at, say, the three bylaws that we have right now, for example, a good example of that would be having trailers or boats in driveways, for example. One part of the community says that's okay. Other parts of the community says part-time, spring and fall or whatever, clean up. And another one says absolutely not, and so forth. So is that a kind of an example in terms of we'll be looking at, say, grandfathering some of these, or how like I could see some the general public coming in and saying, no, I'm not conforming. I've been doing it for 15 years. I lived here, and now you're telling me I can't, and so forth. So how do we massage that in terms of the needs of today moving forward, but also looking at the diversity of what is conforming and non-conforming?
That's such a great question. It's hard to answer that question because it kind of depends a bit on the issue. I'll say a couple of things with respect to RV, like as an example, with respect to RVs, boat parking and that sort of thing, which is a great example. Our intent in this bylaw would be to bring forward some new regulations. So the idea is that just generally, the new zoning bylaw will apply on sort of a go forward basis. If someone's been doing something on their property and it's been legal up until the new bylaw comes into effect, the new bylaw doesn't change that. They still have that ability. However, we have the discretion in this process. Do we want to recognize that as a permitted use moving forward, or do we want to create sort of a legal non-conforming situation for them? So we do have the option of recognizing existing situations or simply ignoring them, but that doesn't mean that they have to change, right? They can always continue their use as long as it was legally established.
So with that in mind, if, for example, I've got the RV and then I parked it there and so forth, and I decided to sell my home and I'm moving forward in that, then the new bylaw would take effect on any of the new homeowners. That wouldn't be grandfathered to the next owner to that home, right?
It actually could be grandfathered to subsequent owners as long as the use is not interrupted. Yeah.
Okay, well, that'll be a good discussion.
I mean,
yes, and that's exactly what I was thinking in thoughts of the north and south. Even though we want to be a community together, there's differences in property size and a field beside you to have a boat and a trailer, but it doesn't make sense in the urban setting to do that. But yeah, how are we going to make those? We're going to have discussion is what we're going to do.
I think, Mr. Hillman.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. And, Bobby gave a great answer, but I think what this one leads to, there is a separate slide on this. And as a number of councilors, no, that's okay, because it gets into the complexity of how do you regulate certain things that are different between former municipalities, but then it triggers the notion of an option is to have non-conforming status. The challenge with this one is the use moves, it comes and goes from the property. So I think, we don't have a clear answer today. This will be an interesting discussion over time. Council did try to address this early on in its life back in the early 2000s. I think Chad had just joined us and it brought forward quite a response from the public. But I think in Bobby's answer, you can see the complexity, and to Councillor Jobin, there is also the nuance of urban and rural, right? And that's a sort of a theme that will flow around this as well. So we're very, very mindful of that. And so it's not just a north-south though, it's an east-west. You know, the former St. Clair Beach had one way of dealing with that issue, Old Tecumseh, and former Township of Sandwich South. So I think more to be said on that. There is a slide on it, but I just want to be clear that it will be a challenging one for us because of that nuance. It's not a use that just sits there. It comes and goes.
Yeah, maybe a better example would have been side yard allowances and so forth, which is more permanent, but they're different within the three areas in that. But I could see that coming, saying, this is it from now on. But yeah, so there's going to be some complexities and some massaging, and I but that one there in particular on the side yard allowances, sheds, for example, you know, is it a meter? Is it 2 meters? Is it, you know, 2 feet or whatever? But anyway.
Yeah, it's a good thought. Matt, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add as well, you know, to the more fixed objects on a lot. Another part of the consistency work that we'll be doing is, for example, each bylaw might have a different definition for what the front yard is, or what a single detached dwelling is, or what retail means. And so we have to look, you know, there really isn't a material difference in what a retail use is. And so we'll be looking at all those, you know, those different things. And then to the point that was also raised, which is fantastic, is that we can also develop standards that differ based on zones. So if you are in an agricultural zone, you can have different requirements that apply in an agricultural area versus, you know, in a neighborhood or a rural residential lot versus an urban lot where you know there's more there's more happening, right? So we can, those types of standards, and it can be very clear of, you know, if you're on a lot in, you know, in an urban area, X applies, and if you're on a farm and you have no neighbors for, you know, meters on either side, you're, you know, Y rule applies. So we can also look at that as well.
Okay. And certainly I'll just echo the point of Brian that the RV and boat parking topic is very complex, and I do expect a lot of discussion on that for sure. So in terms of, like I said, we had an open house to kick off the project and present that initial discussion paper. I think we had just about a half a dozen members of the public show up, which is kind of typical in a study of this nature. Unfortunately, we'll keep, you know, certainly exploring other opportunities to engage people on this. But we had great conversations with the people that did come out, and they did raise RVs and boat parking as an issue specifically. And they also talked a little bit about Old Castle Hamlet, and I understand the town is initiating a study to help respond to those comments. So I do see some good initial input from the public so far, and they've kind of flagged a couple of things to keep on our radar. So I appreciated that. Next slide, please. So now I'm shifting into a discussion around the new discussion paper, which has just come out. And this is sort of a more deep dive exploration of some of the key issues to be addressed in this project. So fundamentally, the new discussion paper, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, it's attempting to create sort of a work plan for writing the new zoning bylaw. You know, writing a new zoning bylaw is kind of complicated, so we want to set out some instructions and some guidance around how we're going to deal with certain issues. So that's really the purpose of this discussion paper. Our intent, of course, is once we've had this conversation with council, once we've gone to the public tomorrow, we'll be updating the discussion paper and, of course, allowing for some written input to be received after that, and then finalizing the discussion paper, I think by the end of June or something like that. So next slide, please. So one of the things discussed in the discussion paper is the concept of, you know, how should this new zoning bylaw look? Like, how should it be structured? How should the mapping look? And I do think that's an important topic because, like I said earlier in the presentation, one of our objectives is to create a user-friendly bylaw. So the discussion paper kind of sets out, well, what are the elements of a user-friendly bylaw? So we want to make sure that the document's going to be as accessible as it can be. Where we can, we'll use plain language. You know, I often find with old zoning bylaws, they tend to write provisions in a very legalistic, lengthy way. And there's a lot of whereas statements, and it's very hard to follow. So our intent with this bylaw is to break down the complexity into small provisions, to small bullets, And wherever it's useful, we'll define a term. Defining terms, I find, is always very beneficial to making a bylaw a lot easier to understand. We'll be looking at incorporating illustrations as well. So you can add illustrations to help speak to some of the provisions and just make it a little bit more engaging. And sometimes it's kind of hard to wrap your head around provisions for sight lines and side yards and these kinds of things. So we'll create some illustrations with the bylaw. To the extent we can, we'll also organize information into tables and matrices. Just helps for comparison and organizing lots of provisions. Next slide, please. So it's a little bit hard to see on the slide, but you can see some snapshots of this in the discussion paper. On the left, is a template of what a zone map could look like. It's not showing any proposed zoning. It's just for illustration purposes. Like, this is the format that we're kind of considering. We'd like to keep things a little bit simple, showing lot lines, showing zone boundaries in color so they pop a little bit. And then on the right side, you'll see a template for what the new zone provisions could look like. So you can see organizing the information into tables. So like, there'll be a permitted use table. It's a lot easier for people to follow that way. Very clear headings, footers, and that sort of thing. So it'll be a big improvement over the current bylaws from a wayfinding point of view. Next slide, please. So one of the key issues that you'll see discussed in this discussion paper is related to the official plan. So the official plan sets out a designation called the Main Street Mixed Use Designation on Tecumseh Road. And it has a vision for this area as being accommodating of different mixed uses, residential with some retail on the ground floor. There's some policies speaking to built form and height and density and that sort of thing. And we noticed that the zoning bylaw currently doesn't really match up with what the official plan is saying. The official plan has this clear vision for this vibrant corridor, but the zoning bylaw in large part is kind of basic commercial zones. It's not really enabling the kinds of uses that the official plan is intending. So we see this significant gap, and I think that there is an option for us to move forward on addressing that. Next slide, please. So as council, I'm sure, knows, development and redevelopment is taking place on the corridor. It's not a long-term vision. It's something that's been happening. And as I said, because the zoning currently only allows for, kind of low order or low grade commercial uses, it doesn't allow for the broad range of uses. What that means is council is having to deal with developments on a site by site basis. So you're having to address site specific amendments for those developments. But if we were to update the zoning in this corridor directly, it would avoid the town having to process those specific amendments, and the town can just articulate its expectations directly in the zoning bylaw rather than trying to negotiate with every developer that comes to the door. Next slide. So we are proposing to address this conflict or this gap, a new Main Street mixed use zone. And we're still thinking about what to call it, but we'll create this zone and apply it along the lands that are designated by the official plan for these uses. As part of that zone, we can set out permitted uses, we can set out criteria for those uses, and we can also set out urban design standards. So we can provide requirements for, bringing the buildings close to the street, having appropriate setbacks that ensure transition with low-rise residential uses nearby. So we can certainly incorporate a full range of different design standards. And also to deal with some of the technical issues, we can include what's called a holding provision. I'm sure council's very familiar with holding bylaws, but a holding bylaw allows the town to kind of create a process so that even though we're zoning for this development can't proceed until the developer has shown to the town that, traffic impacts will be addressed, that servicing is available. All the technical stuff that has to go into planning will still have to happen before development's allowed to proceed. So ultimately, though, I do think implementing the zone would be a pretty substantial improvement and take a great stride towards implementing the official plan. So I'll just pause on that. That was one of the key issues. So I'll just pause there to see if there's any thoughts or input on that one. Okay, seeing none. Next slide, please. So another key issue that we've identified in the discussion paper is this notion of regulating sight lines. So the official plan has policies speaking to, the idea that if you have a waterfront lot, it's pretty, you've paid a premium for that lot, and you kind of expect to have a nice, beautiful view of the water. So one thing a zoning bylaw can do is it can have provisions that help to protect your sight lines so that your neighbors aren't building, gigantic garages and structures that impede your view of the water. Currently, there are some provisions that the town administers that does this, but we've read them and working with the town, they're very hard to understand. They're hard to apply. They're just kind of written in a very unclear way. And of course, they're different across the town as well. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what we're looking at is proposing a revised framework of zoning provisions for sightlines. We see that the official plan directs it, and we see an opportunity to simplify the current provisions of the zoning bylaw and incorporate a new framework for those provisions. So we have a few options in front of us. We can either carry forward the existing provisions in Tecumseh, carry forward the provisions in St. Clair, or we can kind of create a new hybrid approach that, we can ultimately start from scratch on this. Like, we have that discretion in this process. So that's ultimately what we're recommending in this regard. Yeah.
Councilor Higginson, you have a question?
Thanks very much. Just on this, the option 3, developing a hybrid and modified standards, it's kind of around the same question that came up before about creating exceptions or trying to avoid the creation of exceptions necessarily to that. But a lot of those properties along St. Clair in my ward and in Councillor Dorner's ward, there is some discussion about things built in the backyards and already built and things like that, which I'm appreciative of this addressing. But I am also cautious that we may just be collecting a bunch of exceptions along the way as well. And I don't know if there's necessarily an answer to that, or it may actually be in that option 3. But I want us to be cautious that it's not just kind of a lot by lot, exception by exception, especially in such a established area currently where there may not be a lot of changes that happen owner to owner to owner. But then also, if there is a change to those owners, that they will have an understanding of what's the changes they can make to their property in and around that, the hybrid or modified standards in the bylaw. So I wonder if I don't even know if I got to a question there, but somewhere in there.
I'll draw a question out of it. I appreciate that. This is another thing that I think is a little bit complicated, kind of like the RV parking stuff, because there have been different rules, which means different things have happened in different places in the town. And I do think we have to tread kind of carefully on this one. Like, I do want to make sure we're finding a balanced approach that kind of reflects what's there now. But at the same time, I'm thinking about town staff's input, which is to have a bylaw that's, easier to use and administer and applies regulations fairly across the waterfront. So I'm hopeful that we can come up with a single set of standards that carries forward what's desirable now, but has a more fair, consistent approach moving forward that's going to be easy to understand.
Thanks for that. And my assumption, and I think I read it in the discussion paper, was that we'll obviously lead with respect for the homeowners and their property, but also lead with a kind of climate conscious lens to that as well. I noticed some language in there that was speaking about heights and things like that were consistent with sightline, but also with those thoughts in mind about as we grow, what that sort of looks like from lake levels and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add just to that. I think what's important for those where we experience things is that when properties are sold on the waterfront in particular, I mean, we've had new homes built, some taken down, and then folks come in and they want to put up an expansion of the home and so forth. We've had a lot of those. So and we become the bad guy, saying, no, you can't do that because the sight lines and we're always reminded, I like that option 3 only because the hybrid piece modified standard across the whole waterfront makes a lot of sense because, to prepare ourselves because property they sell them, and some of them build bigger homes on the property, and obviously they want to use every able piece of property that they have up to the waterfront and that, and it does create some problems. And I know the planning department and so forth have had a lot of complaints, where folks were, no, you're not allowed to do that, and then there's a usually, eliminates what you want to do is eliminate the neighborhood dispute or the neighborhood dispute. If everything's is black and white and it's across the board from the Windsor limits to Pike Creek, then I think we've accomplished what is there. And to your point, in terms when people buy that waterfront, they want to have not this peripheral type look, they want to have this ability and so forth. So I think that that option 3 does make some sense.
Understood. Appreciate that input. Thank you.
Go
Thank you, Your Worship. The one question I have, and we've mentioned sightlines with the lake, but and I don't want to jump forward at all, but I think sightlines also with height, and I will recognize that there's a lot of changes with provincial policy statement, which we have a report later on tonight. I get more questions and concerns over sightlines which are vertical, right? And developments which are abutting. So I'm just wondering through this, is there any, tool or ability, for us? Because I think the overwhelming concern is someone, is going to build and then they're looking in my backyard, either where I had a 1-story or 2-story house, and then maybe there's going to be a 3 or 4-story. So I don't want to jump ahead, but I'm just wondering, because we are talking about sight lines, there's, out and then there's down. So I'm just curious, through this, if there's any, tools, within the new bylaw to address that. And if, and the challenge I sometimes have is where is too close and where is far enough, right? And is it, looking down? So I'm just, I recognize it is a complicated issue and there's a lot that clouds it, but I'm just curious through the rezoning and with the provincial policy statement and the need for increased density and all of it, how, and if we can address that in the new zoning bylaw at all.
Sure. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I will say that the zoning bylaw is the tool to deal with what you're describing. And we can deal with that in terms of, like, as maximum height requirements. And I think every zone in this bylaw will have a maximum height standard at a minimum. And we'll want to make sure that that's sensitive to the character of the specific neighborhood within which that zone is applied. Yeah, the point about, I guess you're speaking about ARUs and you're speaking about, the notion of the province allowing for and encouraging more density in neighborhoods. I think that's something for us to take away as to, what setbacks are appropriate for those kinds of uses. So I do think setbacks are one of the tools you can use to help address the privacy situation, height setbacks. Unfortunately, we don't have conditional zoning. Where you could, in some other jurisdictions, you could, require something to be done in exchange for something. So if you have an ARU, you have to do a certain amount of landscaping. We don't have that kind of zoning in Ontario, unfortunately, but we can still set up some criteria that relates to setbacks and height at a minimum. So I think that's something to be taken away.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Jeffrey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To Councillor Houston, earlier when we referred to one of the objectives of the bylaw being to implement the policy direction of the new official plan, well, you'll recall in the new official plan, we've included compatibility policies, and it speaks of intrusive overlook, which is the issue you're referring to, right? It's what is intrusive overlook exactly? It's not really well defined in the official plan. So the zoning bylaw is an opportunity to better define that and have some technical guidance on with respect to what intrusive overlook is. So.
Okay, next slide, please. So another important function of the official plan is to set out a strategy and policies for protecting sensitive environmental features. And if you're familiar with the official plan, we've included a little snippet there. That's the schedule of the official plan that shows the natural heritage system across the town. And we've looked through those policies to see, is zoning bylaw an appropriate tool to support implementing these policies? I certainly think that, at a minimum, whenever council deals with a development application, and there are sensitive environmental features on the land, council will usually zone those features into an environmental protection zone. So oftentimes through a development application review process, these features can be protected. But we're kind of looking at this through the lens of the comprehensive bylaw. Is there something that we can do in this overarching bylaw to support the implementation of those policies? So I'll just, for brief context, I'll just say the official plan identifies three kinds of features, sort of three levels of features. There's a natural environment designation, natural environment overlay, and a restoration opportunities overlay. Next slide, please. Within the natural environment designation, the official plan really intends for development to be directed away from these areas. These areas are considered to be sensitive features that do warrant protection. Now, the official plan only delineates, I think there's only 4 little areas of natural environment designation shown on that schedule. So we actually think that there is a good opportunity here, given what those features are, to zone that directly in the new zoning bylaw, because it is very focused on just a few little features across the town, and given that the policies are very strong in terms of protecting those features. Next slide, please. And the next part of the official plan schedule is the natural environment overlay. This one's a little bit trickier, because this is, I believe this part of the official plan is more of an approximation, based on data available at the time. This is where it's believed that there are some features that should be preserved if they can be and if they exist, but it kind of requires site-specific analysis to assess whether they're impactful or not, whether they exist or not. So the official plan generally intends for a study to be conducted. And as noted, it's an overlay. So it's kind of reflecting the fact that there is an underlying land use. Like, a lot of these features exist on existing farms, right? So there's sort of that underlying farm use as well as the feature that we have to consider. So that's kind of the context on that. Next slide. And the last one, the last feature of the official plan is the restoration opportunities overlay. This overlay, I think, is even a little bit, I don't want to use the word vague, but it's a little bit more conceptual than the other 2 overlays. It's an idea that, if ideally the town could see some of these areas protected, and for some of these features to be restored over time to create a more resilient natural heritage network across the town. So next slide, please. So there's these 3 different designations, these 3 different official plan features. So like I said, the natural environment designation, which is the darkest green, we feel that this is something we can directly implement in the zoning bylaw, because it is just focused on just a few small sites. It's not impactful to the landowners. So that's something that we could proceed with. The restoration opportunities overlay at the bottom, sort of the medium green, we don't view that that's appropriate to be implemented in the zoning bylaw, because the restoration opportunities are shown more conceptually. They require study to be done. And for the most part, those features exist over existing farmland. And it's kind of hard to implement that in zoning. If you know about zoning, zoning is a very black and white kind of a tool. Something's either permitted or not permitted. So if we were to map the restoration opportunities in the zoning bylaw, the zoning wouldn't be able to say anything about it. We wouldn't want to restrict the existing uses. So it's the overlay I view as a tool that's better implemented through other processes, like through development application review when the town receives a rezoning application. Now, the natural environment overlay, I think, is kind of interesting. It's sort of in the middle. It's something that I think we have an opportunity to implement in the official plan. The official plan does have strong language intending for those features to be protected. And so we've come up with sort of an idea about how to implement it. And our idea is to essentially include that overlay as an overlay in the zoning bylaw. So those features that you see in sort of that olive green would be shown in the zoning bylaw. And the intent in the zoning bylaw would be for existing buildings to be permitted and to be expanded without restriction. And it would also allow for accessory structures to be constructed. So the intent of the overlay would be to restrict kind of major new development, but allow minor stuff to proceed without being inhibited by the new bylaw. So sort of in other words, we tried to find a middle ground approach with that natural environment overlay. And I think it's kind of an innovative way of moving forward with implementing some of those policies. So there's a lot of information there, I suppose. So maybe I'll just pause there and see if anyone would like to chime in on that. But ultimately, I do think the zoning bylaw can support some of these policies. But like I said, with the restoration opportunities overlay, I think that's something better addressed through other tools and not the zoning bylaw. It's a bit of a technical discussion, I suppose.
Through the mayor to council and the consultants, I favor the natural environment overlay. We used that in Oxford County when I was a planner back in the day, and worked very well. Good to flag it in zoning bylaw, because otherwise, if it's just in the OP, you don't necessarily know that feature exists, and some things can go sideways on you if that's the case. So I think it's a very convenient way to cross-reference the two documents.
I appreciate that input very much. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you can flesh that idea out a little bit for me so that I understand. Is it an opportunity for us to, or is it a layer for us to see what opportunities exist? Or is it a layer for us to understand if someone comes to us with an idea, what should be allowable under that distinction?
Yes, through Mr. Mayor. So the intent of it would be to apply regulation to it. So generally speaking, something should only be in the zoning bylaw if we're applying some kind of regulation. So our thinking, and we're very open about what approach we take if there's some other ideas about it, but our thinking is we'll have a schedule attached to the bylaw. It'll show the natural environment overlay on the schedule, so it'll show all the little features. And the intent is that where the feature is shown, you can expand an existing building and you can construct accessory structures, but you would not be able to complete major construction, like a new building, establish a new use or change the use. That would require a Planning Act process. And the intent of that is, as was pointed out earlier, is to kind of flag for the town the fact that there are these policies of the official plan that apply, because otherwise, those policies would be missed unless there was like a major development application. This is kind of like a way of catching people and saying, hey, there's something in the official plan that should be considered. And we're applying sort of like a modest amount of regulation to that to help enforce those policies. Okay. Sure, Matt wants to jump in.
Through the mayor, and so I think there's a couple interesting pieces here regarding the restoration opportunities overlay in the official plan. When you really look into the details of the schedule, you'll see it really kind of rounding out, if there's a square with a chunk missing, it rounds out an area where, whether through conservation efforts, through future development, you'll also see it applied to drains. So through future work, you'll see those areas naturalized over time. So it's less of a zoning issue, but rather the intention of building out a system in those areas. With respect to the natural environment overlay in sort of the yellowy green color, underneath that, it would be zoned, the property would be still zoned agriculture. So, the zoning today is agricultural. the zoning wouldn't change, but that overlay would be added to speak to those regulations that Bobby spoke to, really to point out the fact that there is that feature, and we need to have some type of protection in place based on what was presented today. And then for the darkest green, the natural environment designation, the zoning would actually change. So they might be zoned, open space today, or agricultural, or some type of industrial, there's only 4 little pockets of it, right? And so the zoning of it would actually change through this process. But again, it's from a property perspective, it's very minimal impact, and the intention isn't to change the zoning in these. As you can see, the most of the green is that overlay, or the 2 overlays. So,
Mayor, if I could, just as a point of clarification, thank you. And the dark natural environment designation, those are publicly owned lands. And they had provincial significance at the time of either their designation identification. And they happen to be, in our case, this isn't always the case in municipalities, they happen to be in public hands, either the municipality, one of them is a provincial owned piece, another is a regionally IRCA. So we're, I don't want to say fortunate, but we have really good control in terms of their public entities, highly restrictive because of their significance for natural heritage features.
And maybe my question would be, when you talk about overlay and so forth, and let's look at Fairplay Woods, which we own, and then we have neighbors. We have a farm to the west, and then to the east we have a private owner that basically, in the meantime, lease it. But down the road, those lands, and even to the north of it, which is the Coxon property, for example. So if those lands were to be developed, we want to protect that Fairplay Woods. So obviously we'd say, okay, we're going to put a 50-meter setback. So, we could actually do that. And I think it'd be wise for us to do that, because, and so is this where we'd use that opportunity in the future in the bylaw, that especially for those landowners that are there saying, look, you want to develop your 180 acres, but there's X number, you cannot, and it must remain natural. So that where you'd be able to use that opportunity.
So through Mr. Mayor, I'll start answering this one. So to start with, zoning is one tool of implementation, and it won't address everything perfectly. So that's a good example of there are currently requirements in the Planning Act, and the sands are shifting a bit, because the provincial rules around natural heritage features are, we know they're up for some consideration of change. But there are requirements already through both OP policy and Planning Act requirements. Natural heritage features have to go through special studies if you're attempting to develop within a certain distance. And that's where a lot of these requirements will come in. No development within a specified distance, dependent on the heritage features, endangered species, and so on, are quite often linked to a natural environment designation. So the zoning will play one part of it, clearly identify those areas, establish what can happen within them. And for the overlay area, which are natural heritage features that don't have the same significance as a provincially significant piece of land, certain things can happen within. And then the opportunities are ones, I think the rounding out was a great example. One day in the future, the town may find itself, or other bodies, could be private interests, could be school groups, it could be our conservation authority. Oh, there's a way we can link that natural heritage feature to that one over there through some easement corridors and plantings. It's very long-term. It's looking at how do we enhance the few features we have. So the zoning will address a certain component of all of that, but there's other legislative tools we'll use to ensure the integrity of the various features that are being identified. So it won't answer all of those issues, but it will be part of the solution, the zoning.
Go ahead.
Well, through the mayor, as you may know, Oxford County is largely rural, and we found this overlay approach to be much more palatable to the farming community, because the underlying zone stayed the same. So if they were farming today, they're farming tomorrow. It's really only if they were proposing or contemplating any kind of major change in that area, like construction, like the consultants have indicated, that these additional requirements would kick in. And but otherwise, it's business as usual, and they continue farming those properties. So it's actually a good also a measure for being able to track the municipalities' efforts to preserve natural heritage features, which there may come a day that we are asked to quantify that by upper orders of government. So this helps us be able to do that through our GIS tools as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great thoughts. So if we're good with that, next slide, please. So the next key topic addressed in the discussion paper relates to neighborhood zoning. So of course, the town consists of all kinds of different residential neighborhoods. And in total, there are 9 different residential zones in total amongst the 3 bylaws. Every bylaw is going to have a different set of standards and permitted uses, different setbacks, different heights. And ultimately, zoning certainly does play a role in facilitating potential housing supply. Thinking about recent provincial changes, which allow up to 3 units on a lot as of right, is the reality that we have to support and implement in the urban areas at least. But with respect to our objectives, firstly, we're looking to consolidate the residential zones as much as we can to simplify the bylaws. However, at the same time, I'm also cognizant of the fact that the residential zones play a role in defining the character of individual neighborhoods, right? Because the zones set out the standards that were in place when the neighborhood was first constructed. So we don't necessarily want to lose all of that detail. We want to keep what's valuable and what's defining for the character. So we'll be looking to consolidate the zones, but retain the desirable details out of them. We certainly also want to focus on flexibility in terms of permitted dwelling types and building requirements in line with provincial policy. But again, though, thinking thoughtfully about impact and what kinds of measures and setbacks do we need to deal with impact. So next slide, please. So a bit more context, I think, as everyone knows, Bill 23 amended the Planning Act to allow up to 3 units as of right. And in the fall of 2022, council began to kind of move forward on that and adopted a zoning framework for additional residential units, allowing for up to 2 such units, or up to one unit if it's attached and 1 if it's detached. So there's, I think, some tweaking required to be consistent with the more recent provincial expectations. So one thing I wanted to put out there, and I think this is something to be consulted on, is, if we think about the province's very significant change, this idea that you have to have 3 units allowed on every lot, it kind of calls into question, what is a single detached dwelling? Does a single detached dwelling kind of even really exist anymore if we're contemplating that kind of intensification? So we think as an option, and again, we're open to input and consultation, but as an option, we could allow semis, allow triplexes, and allow duplexes as of right within the residential zones, just thinking about the fact that the province essentially allows for that anyway. So that's something that we're thinking about as an option moving forward. Next slide. Actually, I'll just pause there if there's any input on that one.
Thank you, Worship. The only question I have with that, if we were to say no, and we have an application that were to come forward and then it was appealed, then because it's in the PPS and because it's in a lot of the newer policies that are coming from the government, would we not be foolish to say no out of the gate to begin with?
That's sort of where I'm coming from, to be honest. Yeah, it's essentially, yeah, like if the province is allowing for 3 residential units and we take a position, no, we don't want a duplex. You can have your 3 residential units that the province allows, but you can't have a duplex. It's a little bit of a contradiction, and it's hard to imagine being successful defending that. if it was appealed.
Yeah, I agree with that statement because, I mean, doing ARUs on existing residential lot, for example, in that, do you have the infrastructure to support that? That's the other piece as well, you know, and I think they kind of putting the cart before the horse, you know, and sort of in that regards. But if you're building something, you know, to essentially have 2 or 3 residences within the lot, then does it make sense to do a duplex or certainly a triplex? And then, yeah, I mean, at least you can build that and build the infrastructure requirement, you know, to deal with it.
If I could, Mr. Mayor, I think the other advantage to it is it gives you some opportunity through the zoning bylaw to put some discipline on what these things will look like and how they occupy a lot, and give a little bit of peace of mind to the neighbors that not just some kind of irregular type of dwelling unit could have materialized beside them as of right.
Councillor.
I appreciate that. Mark, I was thinking about this in terms, and I thought about it a little earlier, but knew we were getting to the ARU side eventually. Thinking about, and I'm glad you put it in the context of residential zones, because I think that's some of the language that this allows us to do, speaking about neighborhoods and the feel of those and the kind of establishments that we currently have, but then thinking about what we have to do as a town, but what the province is basically pushing us to do as a town as well. But I'm thinking about these in terms of what the discussion we had about sightlines and ARUs and 3 dwellings allowed as of right, and what language, to Councillor Houston's point, what language are we able to maintain in our, whether it's official plan, whether it's the zoning bylaw, that will, taking into account all of those pieces, will allow us to still have some control over the things that are important to Tecumseh while not getting in the way of growth that we want and that the province is declaring that we must.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, absolutely. You know, what I think we can do in this bylaw is certainly reflect the provincial expectations, but we can set out standards that are appropriate for Tecumseh. Like, we can think about what the impacts are of these uses and set out some standards for them. So I don't believe that the province has dictated the specific zone standards at this time. I know that they can pass regulations that will basically twist our arms on this, but I don't think they have. I think they may have passed a regulation that limits how we can set out parking requirements for ARUs, but I don't think they've expressed anything about setbacks and that kind of thing. So I do think we have that discretion still.
And really, we're beginning to see a lot of the, you know, the intensification and say density. A good example of that, we got 3 residential lots on West Ross Road, 3 homes that were, 2 of them actually were demolished. And so now 18 units are coming out. So it is something that makes a heck of a lot more sense than you know. I hate to say the word handy, putting all these units on one piece of property. So it makes so much sense. But I like to your point, and I think too, is that we can kind of set the benchmark in terms of what we're looking at. And if the province is looking at putting more houses and so forth, then at least we should be able to meet that demand, but do it under our auspice.
I think that's totally fair. Yeah. And that's sort of what I like. I'm sort of hearing at least a little bit of support for considering permitting semis and duplexes subject to standards. And that's why I like putting a spotlight on it. It lets us actually set the standards for them. Whereas if we took a principled stance, we don't want them, then we kind of miss the window of setting the standards for them. So
I think the biggest piece, and you're probably going to hear it, and we had one instance on Riverside Drive, actually, single family homes, big homes, and we just allowed a semi to be built. Beautiful, I mean, 2,600 square feet on each unit, so they're not small by any means, but it was controversial for a lot of the residents and so forth. So and you know, we're willing to deal with that, but I would surmise that we'll probably have less of an impact by doing duplexes and so forth on a given property than versus you know, ARUs. And one makes a lot of sense to me, but two and three, that to me is just that would be very difficult in order for us to be able to sell that to the, you know, to the neighborhood.
You know, fair enough for sure. Yeah, I think the province is very prescriptive about the ARUs. I don't think there's flexibility, but on the semis and duplexes, absolutely. I think we can take that away and craft some standards for that. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Councillor.
thank you, Your Worship. Just on while we're on this, I two things. Is the zoning bylaw to the case that the mayor just brought up? That was a duplex and it really looked like a single family home. But any of the aesthetics of duplexes and triplexes, if they were to go in, is the zoning bylaw the tool, or what is the tool that we would then dictate? We allow this, but we want it to look like this, right? Is this it, or is there another?
Go ahead.
Okay, through you, Mr. Mayor, just, well, this will be a little travel back in time. If you all recall Bill 23, there's actually been a substantial pulling back from what a municipality can do. And you'll recall that up to, I believe, 10 units, we can't even use site plan control. Now, case in point, there's two buildings just down from the Legion that was put under site plan control, two separate lots, two buildings having 6 units. In today's era, no more site plan control. Now, the development community can still deliver on quality housing, but the tools available to us as a municipality have been removed in that regard. So there are significant limitations on what can happen, and a friendly reminder, just even, you know, we're tasked with a couple of things: more housing, more attainable housing, and more affordable housing. Put those three together and they're not all going to be semis that look like the one that was approved site specifically on Riverside Drive. You know, I think the messaging that's coming from not just, you know, our fellow government agencies above us, but from the community and from, you know, just the population, is that there needs to be more choice. And what that means, probably type, but also the size of the type of units that are coming forward. They can still be quality builds, but directly to your question, we're not going to have many tools available that probably are going to respond to where I think you're probably imagining that might go in the zoning.
So while my director has painted the glass as half empty, I'm going to give you the glass as half full. On the flip side of that, it does allow you to define the setbacks, right? The side yard, the front yard, the rear yard, you know, the driveway, all of that type of thing through the zoning bylaw. Those are standard provisions, and at least to that extent, you can control where the thing sits on the lot and ensure a bit of privacy for the neighboring land uses through your zoning bylaw provisions. To the consultant's point, if we don't do that, then and these and 3 units are allowed as of right, and they decide to build a triplex, then I think we're in trouble. So I think this gives you a modicum of control. Not, Brian's right, not what we would have had under site plan control, but at least that there are some provisions there that are standard.
And thank you for that. And my second question was, I believe throughout the town now we are standardized from a height restriction, right? I think that we're all in R1 or R2. I think it's standard. So, you know, are we contemplating at all with, you know, anything that the government is coming down with, you know, any increase in height in basic density, or is that something which we've already addressed and that is in the official plan for height?
Sure, through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, the discretion for regulating height is still within our project in the zoning bylaw. So as far as I know, the province has not dictated height changes, but they've simply dictated the fact that multiple units have to be allowed on a lot. So we do still have that discretion, and we'd look to the official plan to give a bit of guidance, but it's probably, you know, a little high level as it usually is. It probably speaks to low rise, so we'll have to translate that into numbers. I think for the most part, what we'd want to do is carry forward the height requirements as they are now, you know, unless there's a good reason to tweak them, like they're not working for some reason. Okay. I appreciate all that context on the, you know, setting out character in a zoning bylaw as well. Agree 100%. You know, we've got a lot of discretion around the setbacks, the location, the height, the driveways. We can have requirements for entrance, like where the entrance is allowed to be located, walkways leading to the entrance, we can do that. What we explicitly cannot do in a zoning bylaw is building materials, you know, those kinds of aesthetic things, just to add on to that point. Okay, so moving on to the next item, which has come up already. Recreational vehicle and boat parking. So we have discretion in the bylaw to set out a regulatory framework to deal with where people are allowed to park RVs and boats on a lot. And I think there's a lot of contextual considerations in this regard, right? I mean, it is a lakefront community. You know, there's demand for people to have these uses, but we also have to think about the impact that having these structures on the property might have. So in our report, we're recommending at least drafting a framework of regulations for further consultation. And in that framework, at least in the report, we've identified some principles or some objectives for what those regulations should be trying to do. So firstly, you know, we should try to have some consistency in the zoning regulations for this. Unless there's a particular reason why, say, a neighborhood should have different regulations. Oftentimes, I find residents can be very frustrated when they're not subject to the same regulations as other places. And keeping in mind too, we can have regulations that are sort of scalable. Like depending on the size of the lot, there might be different regulations. So that can help to address sort of the contextual differences across the town. We'll certainly, we want the regulations to ensure that they're not encroaching on sight lines. So we can set some setbacks as to where these uses are parked. We can recognize that there's varying lot frontages, size and lot areas. So, you know, again, the regulations can be sort of scalable. Recognize the urban and rural context, right? Like I certainly think at a minimum, you could probably have a little bit more laxed requirements in the rural area, just given the size of the lots, as long as they meet some criteria. Avoiding overcrowding of boats and RVs in urban areas, you know, thinking about the aesthetic impacts. That's something we could think about. Should they be directed to certain parts of the lot? Considering impact on the neighborhood aesthetic. Like, is it appropriate to have these uses parked in the front, or should there be sort of like a size limitation to deal with that aesthetic impact, which can be kind of subjective? We can also consider seasonality of boat and RV parking. I've seen some other bylaws across Ontario, you know, they'll have a standard set of regulations, which are a little bit hard to achieve, but they'll give a little bit of wiggle room. Like, you know, maybe for 2 weeks out of the year, you don't have to comply with the regulations. You have like a little bit of a window just to give some people flexibility and avoid having unnecessary variances. So I think ultimately we're recommending producing a framework of regulations to help implement all of those different principles I've identified. So I'll just pause there.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Mayor. I know way back, we had a bylaw enforcement officer that went around taking pictures and trying to grandfather certain properties when they would change the ownership, and then it kind of just died off. And I'm going back 15, 20 years. So in terms of moving forward with the grandfather, we talked about, you know, these properties that may be legal non-conforming. Is there any legalities? Is there work on the town to be able to implement some program where, yes, you're able to have your boat, but once you sell, or once you no longer have a boat in that property, that it goes back to this designation or this zoning? what kind of work is involved in the town? Is that difficult? Is that something done through title? Has that been done before? Because that would be a fair way of doing it versus, telling someone, no, you've been doing it for so many years. You got to move your boat or your RV now.
It's a great question. I think it's something that we have to explore and discuss a little bit more internally. I certainly understand the point, right? If you've been parking your RV on your property for many years and suddenly this new bylaw comes into effect and it has these very constraining rules, that can be very frustrating for people. They'll have to find somewhere else to park their RV potentially, unless they can show that they're a legal non-conforming use. So, is there a way to grandfather specific sites and lots? I think that's something we'd have to kind of take away and consider. I haven't seen that done through a comprehensive zoning bylaw review process, just because, the process for that would be quite onerous, and you'd very likely miss some of them too if you tried to do a survey of sites. I guess another way of doing it would be to sort of make it more voluntary, like create like sort of an application process of some sort where people could ask for some special consideration. So I think it's something we'd have to take away and look at a bit more, but maybe staff would like to weigh in.
Certainly would, through the mayor to council and the consultants. I would be opposed and not favorable to something that sets up a whole new process of applications and trying to keep track of these things. We don't have the bandwidth to do that within the administration. So I would ask you to avoid that kind of high maintenance system.
Okay, noted.
Go ahead.
Yep, and just through Mr. Mayor, to follow up on the CAO, I wanted to clarify one thing and then just add to that. It came up a few times this evening that, when someone changes ownership, and I buy from Phil, and the ownership has nothing to do with zoning. Zoning is a point in time. The bylaw is adopted, and it clearly establishes what is permitted and what is not permitted. This whole notion of when does something become legal non-conforming, does it have status? And you would have heard Bobby say it earlier. If a use exists and we go and zone something different for it, that use has every right to legally continue. We can't take that right away. But if the use ceases to exist, a cessation, a discontinuation of the use for an intended period of time, which the courts have spoken to a little bit, that's when something loses its status. So it has nothing to do with changes of ownership. Just to follow up on just a discussion to date, as it relates to, trying to catalog things and make an application process. And I think there was reference to some 15 years ago, something took place. The effort that took place then was just trying to quantify who has these things in the community. The resources were used to try and come up with that answer through some cataloging. And it was, it's challenging. This is going to be an interesting one because St. Clair Beach has one way of doing it. Park it for a few weeks, clean it up, take it away. Then our enforcement people have to somehow track that. Tecumseh, no rules, but they've existed for decades. So that's where they have some legal non-conforming status. Sandwich South has a little bit of a different twist on the whole thing. So 3 very different approaches that we need to come up to the point, an approach that does not put the municipality in some position of having to exert efforts that we can't deliver on, but give council and the community a sense of fairness. So this one will not go without some further discussion for sure.
Yeah, because it is, I mean, I lived on a street where it was, I call it a free for all. We had RVs, we had boats, we had trailers, and I'll tell you, beautiful homes, but it's just like the lawns were full of dandelions. That I equate that. And one of the reasons why we moved on in that regards. And I know there's been times where an individual had a cabin cruiser for 5 years on the lot, never moved, and then tarps flapping in the wind, and the sight line's not there, and neighbors just complaining to no end, and there wasn't much we could do about it. Those are the things I think you're trying to certainly avoid. So I know moving forward, I think that's the key moving forward, and especially I think we got a fresh canvas in a lot of the new areas that we're building. And then this is where I think, we start fresh and then basically deal with it. I'm very fortunate now because in the covenant, it's all townhomes. The covenant says no trailers, no boats, only vehicles in the driveway, nothing else. And I'll tell you, it's beautiful. And in that regards, but that is probably one of the biggest complaints is we have the black and we have the white. And the ones that have it want to keep it, and the ones that don't have, well, don't want it, period. And I think that's the difficult part. And to have somebody go, like you said, take pictures and so forth, that's daunting. And so in that regards, but we need something, obviously, and I'll be curious to see how the draft comes, in particular on this moving forward.
Absolutely. Appreciate the input on that. Thank you. If there's nothing else on that, next slide. So the report is, fairly comprehensive. There's a certain amount of time available for this discussion today. So I wanted to touch on what I thought were the key issues, but you'll find other topics addressed in the report. One of them is future development zoning. So just briefly in a nutshell, we're recommending the creation of a new zone and applying that new zone where the town intends for future development to occur. So areas of urban land that are not zoned for urban development yet, rather than leaving an agriculture zone, we recommend using a future development zone just to help create that optical alignment with the official plan. Natural hazard zoning, so floodplains, erosion hazards, and so on. We have a little bit of updated mapping from the official plan that we can reflect directly in the regulations of the bylaw. We don't see that as being a substantial difference in the current approach the town does. The town already has regulations for it. We'll just kind of sync it up with the new mapping. Employment area zoning, we have some discussion in the paper on that. Namely, we need to make sure that the permitted uses in the employment areas within which there's a lot of provincial policy protecting their employment function. We'll need to make sure that the zoning in the employment areas matches the official plan. So the permitted uses have to be very closely aligned with the official plan. There's a lot of provincial interest in ensuring that non-employment uses are directed outside of employment areas. So the discussion paper deals with that. And then we've incorporated some discussion around some of the recent provincial planning changes, but we're still wrapping our heads around what that means and how that affects this process. I think generally speaking, the new PPS, the new provincial policy statement, would largely be implemented through the town's official plan rather than the zoning bylaw. So I don't really anticipate a lot of impact on that, but we do have to look at it and make sure that that's the case.
Yeah, go ahead, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick question either through to the consultants or Mr. Holman. The Bill 97 received the first reading in April this year in terms of creating more housing and that whatnot. And there's always that talk about affordable, attainable. We don't know what the interpretation of that is and what that means. Will that affect, like in terms of when we do the zoning as a town, do we need to designate where these affordable, attainable homes will be able to be for a developer? Or is that just going to be included as part of a zoning regulation for the town? So my question is, does the town need to specifically say this area here is for affordable, attainable, or do we have to wait for this Bill 97 to get all those regulations before we know that answer?
Through you, Mr. Chair. The short answer is no. I don't see any mechanism in the zoning to deal with affordability or tenureship or anything like that. The zoning bylaw really deals with residential unit types just in terms of permitted types. So are we permitting singles? Are we permitting semis and towns and triplexes? And where are they going? I think there's sort of like a broad principle with the provincial legislation to ensure that our zoning bylaws are contemplating a broad range of different unit types across the municipality. And, the official plan gives us that direction. And so I think really this is just about, considering broadening permitted use types to help support that. But I would say that there's really no direct implication.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and through the mayor, I'll also just add that, town staff have shared with us the work, the soon to be done work on the housing action plan, and we'll be taking a look at that and, considering how, to Bobby's point, dwelling types into our earlier conversation about duplexes, triplexes, how that all squares away, as well as, the mixed use area. All of that together helps address affordability in a range of different ways and different housing choices in different areas of the town.
Okay, next slide. So we'll just pause there for any final items, and certainly we're very open-minded if there are other key issues that you'd like to see addressed through this project.
Go ahead, Ms. Halen.
Through Mr. Mayor, if no one else is raising their hand, I did not want to, and we as a team did not want to have this go by without acknowledging there are a number of items that are on the outstanding issues list on the council agenda. So I'll just raise some of them we've touched on. Some of them are very similar. So parking of basically the cab of a transport trailer in residential areas has a bit of a theme that associates itself with the rec vehicles, slightly different, but there has to be consistency applied that's being worked on. The short-term rentals that was looked at briefly in discussion paper number 1. It didn't surface through this one. It's not off the radar. It's a matter that has a number of tools available to it in terms of how we regulate those. That will come back to council through not only considerations for how we identify that as a use in the zoning bylaw, but probably just waving the flag. There's a regulatory environment that can be developed around those that's quite outside of zoning. And, we would look to Mr. Auger to assist in that regard. So those issues have not just gone away. They're still there. They're being looked at. Really, the task tonight was just to bring some items forward that would cause, the brain to get active, and it has clearly. And those items are still a part of the project to be addressed to council's satisfaction.
Thank you, Worship. And, I'm just looking, I do see we have the open house on our town website. And I was just trying to see if, because I can't recall that I may have saw it on Twitter or anything, but I am looking forward to hearing the public's feedback, our residents on their input here, because I think it's something which, will affect, the fabric of the town. So I'm really interested, and hopefully we can push that out and get a good response there tomorrow. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I just had one final slide. Good segue into the final next steps. So our main next step is to obtain input from council and from the public tomorrow, and we'll do what we can to solicit meaningful input from the public. And then ultimately we'll be updating our discussion paper and finalizing that. I think by the end of June would be the target for that. And then of course working on the draft zoning bylaw. So the intent is that we'll work away on that document over the summer and look to prepare that for a public presentation early in the fall. So that concludes the presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you very much. And certainly looking forward, as Councillor Houston alluded to, the response from the general public and so forth, the good, the bad, I don't want to say ugly, but the indifferent maybe. But I think it's important. We've seen, after amalgamation and that, the difficulties of implementing 3 separate communities and trying to explain to the general public why you can't have it here, but you can have it over there and so forth. So it'll be a wonderful day when basically we're all going to be under the same roof, so to speak. So I think I'm looking forward to that conversation, because once that first draft or the draft comes forward and so forth. And then I would just extend to my council as well, is that in the meantime, prior to the open house and so forth, but any questions or anything that you think, that comes up and so forth, jot it down, send an email. And so that could be taken into the discussion as well. So with that, gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you for for coming out today and sharing, the background and the importance of getting this thing right. And I can see now that timelines are the Gantt chart, so to speak, is laid out for us. And looking forward to, the final results. So with that, the report has been moved and not moved yet, has been brought forward. So I could have a motion to receive the report. Councillor Tonio, Councillor Dorner, all in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And with that, members of council, adjournments in order. Councillor Houston, Councillor Jobin, all in favor? Opposed? That is carried. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you very much.